There's no place we need to protect more than our home. It's our castle where we live with all that's important to us. Sadly, criminals are getting better and better at using technology to overcome our defenses. Is it time to take back the technological edge? As drones and robotics improve, could they emerge as cutting-edge defensive tools for defense of our castle? And how would the law deal with the use of these novel technologies for defensive purposes? Let's talk about it. I am, of course, attorney Andrew Branca for the Law of Self-Defense, and for those of you who stay to the end, I'll share with you how you can get a free copy of our best-selling book, The Law of Self-Defense Principles, your handbook to being hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, or your property. A Law of Self-Defense member recently sent me a news report of a home defender who made use of a drone to counter a criminal attack on his castle. Separately, my good buddy Will Parker, a self-defense instructor up in the Kalispell area of Montana, sent me a news story of a robot, essentially, being marketed for use against intruders of highly defensible properties, such as homes and businesses. So this raises the question, as drones and robotics become increasingly sophisticated, to what extent can they be used to augment the defense of the structures that protect and shelter everything that's of greatest value to us? The first thing we need to do in answering this question is recognize that there are really two distinct applications to which drones and robots can be applied in terms of home defense. These are observation on the one hand and use of force on the other. Sometimes these two distinct capabilities might be combined into a single drone or robot, but in terms of evaluating their lawfulness, we need to treat each separately because the legal rules differ for observation and use of force. Let's consider observation by drone or robot first, and by this I mean observation in the absence of any use of force. It goes without saying that observation has always been a key component of home defense. You can hardly defend against what you can't see, after all. Even simple peepholes and sliding panels and doors, for example, have long been used for the purpose of observing what's on the other side of a door without having to compromise the security of the door by unlocking and opening it to peer out. In recent decades, security cameras have become ubiquitous throughout our society. Once relegated largely to places like banks and liquor stores, they're now just about everywhere, including built into our doorbells. In fact, the car I recently bought my wife, a Tesla, is equipped with cameras that maintain observation around the vehicle at all times. More recently, these cameras have been brought to another level through the use of computer augmentation and now even artificial intelligence. The cameras on my wife's car, for example, don't merely observe the vehicle's surroundings. They alert her upon her return to any close encounters that occurred while she was away. Doorbell and security cameras can increasingly be tuned to trigger an alert when an apparent human enters the field of view, while ignoring when, for example, a dog passes through the field of view. By the way, this is a feature abused by thieves who may now pass through the field of view of a camera on their hands and knees to fool the camera's algorithm. I expect we're also not far away from having drones available as a component of home surveillance. Already, recreational drones can be programmed to follow the controller, for example. I have friends who have drones fly behind them and track them as they ride on their motorcycles. Drones can also be set to follow other pre-programmed courses of flight. Why not a drone that can be released upon some security trigger that would automatically fly a circle around a home, perhaps using thermal imaging at night, to assess what threats may be in the area, with all this imagery sent back to the owner inside the castle in real time? This could be particularly useful for more rural homes with lots of open space and the distance and obstacles for bad guys to conceal themselves from cameras mounted on a home. In my experience, a large fraction of the good guy cases of self-defense and home defense that get into legal trouble are the result of ambiguity about what's actually happening. In fact, I refer to this as the zone of ambiguity. People under stress find themselves compelled to make use of force decisions with deeply imperfect information, and then end up making poor use of force decisions based on that imperfect information, or they place themselves into dangerous circumstances in an effort to acquire better information. Even with a great many security cameras, it can be difficult to get full coverage, especially if the environment is subject to change, such a panel van parked at the curb. You're unlikely to have situated a camera able to see behind such a transient piece of cover. If you hear noises from out behind that panel van, do you go out to investigate, increasing your vulnerability? Do you just hunker down in your home and wait to see how things develop? Do you call the police with an ambiguous concern and hope they bother responding? Do you just stay awake all night? What if a drone could be deployed to fly around the area of the suspicious activity? Then you'd know if there was a thief, how many thieves, how they might be armed, and so forth, without having to leave the security of your home. Especially if much of the technical operation of the drone were autonomous, just pointed in the general direction and it does the rest, feeding the video right to the phone in your hand. Similarly, what if you had a dog-like observational robot that could walk around your property, peer around obstacles, even peer under things like vehicles, something a flying drone might be poorly suited for? Now, importantly, not only is this kind of augmented observational capability important for the purpose of making tactical decisions in the moment, it's also vital for being able to articulate in an evidence-based way why those decisions were reasonable. After all, everything you do in self-defense, all your perceptions, your decisions, your actions, have to be reasonable in order to be lawful. Here, reasonable means the application of your powers of reason to actual evidence. I believed this to be true. I made this decision. I took this action based on that evidence. If your perceptions, decisions, and actions are instead based merely on speculation or imagination, they are not legally defensible. That's why I often say that speculation is not a legal defense, and that more evidence is generally good for good guy cases of self-defense or defense of dwelling. Even better if the evidence on which you're basing your perceptions, decisions, and actions was actually captured, recorded by your augmented observational drones and robots, so that they could be played for investigators, prosecutors, judges, and jurors. So that's the legal value and importance of the observational potential of drones and robots. But what about their use of force potential? Can you lawfully make use of drones and robots that are actually armed? My buddy Will Parker recently brought to my attention the sub-lethal remote gun, currently manufactured and offered for sale in South Africa. It's a remotely controlled, pole-mounted device that contains both a camera and a mechanism for firing rubber or ceramic balls with sufficient velocity to be accurate out to 75 meters. The device is manipulated with something similar to a video game controller. Here's a bit of video from the manufacturer describing the device. All right, there's an apparent car thief. And shots. Now, those are not gunshots. Those are rubber or ceramic balls that are being fired, sufficient to scare away the thief. And there's the device. You know, I can't talk over it because there's sound. Let's go back to the beginning. Okay, can we go back to the beginning and let me know before I'll tell you when to start it? Here's a bit of video from the manufacturer describing the device.
Sublethal remote guns are security devices located high on poles overlooking your property, or even inside your business. Remote guns gives you the capability to fight back against armed criminals without putting yourself at risk. The remote gun shoots a bullet very similar to a police rubber bullet and is non-lethal. A remote gun has 360 degrees movement around and 100 degrees vertically. The remote gun is controlled with a hand controller, similar to a gaming controller.
So there are a few aspects of this device relevant from a legal perspective. And of course, I'll be applying American law here, not South African law, where this is manufactured and sold. It's important to note that the device described is very much not autonomous. It is making no decisions on its own. It does nothing unless controlled by a human being. It's this characteristic of the device that distinguishes it from a booby trap. And booby traps come with their own legal problems that I'll circle back to in a moment. As a device that's controlled by a human being, This device is really not legally distinguishable from any other weapons platform being controlled by a human being, including pepper spray in the non-deadly force context or a lethal firearm in the deadly force context. That is, the same conditions that would have to be met before you'd be privileged to use non-deadly force against someone, say in the form of pepper spray, would have to be met before you could use this device in its intended non-deadly manner. Generally, even simple trespass could justify the use of non-deadly force, as would an attempt at theft of property, such as a car out of a driveway. Similarly, the same conditions that would have to be met before you'd be privileged to use deadly force against someone, say in the form of a firearm, would have to be met before you could use this device in a deadly force manner. We'd have to imagine here that the device had the option to be equipped to remotely operate a firearm, for example, which it does not. If it did, however, you'd be privileged to use it to apply deadly force to someone, just as if you were physically present with a firearm in hand. That is, in general, you'd need to be reasonably perceiving that the person against whom you were using deadly force was presenting as an unlawful, imminent threat of deadly force harm to some innocent person. Now, of course, if you're operating the device remotely and you know there are no innocent people on the property, then there could be no innocent people present who you would be protecting from deadly harm. It's quite possible, however, that perhaps you're off on a business trip, having left your family back at home, and they are vulnerable to a deadly force attack on your castle. In that case, using this device remotely to neutralize that deadly force threat against your family, even to the extent of using deadly force to do so, would be lawful, even though you're not personally present. I'll note in passing that the same argument in favor of the lawful use of deadly force could be made even in defense of mere personal property, such as to prevent the theft of a car out of your driveway in Texas, which does allow for the use of deadly force in defense of mere personal property under specific circumstances. I'll link to the relevant Texas statute in the description for those of you interested in that. But what if we consider this device in a more advanced context, augmented by robotics and artificial intelligence, so that its operation is more autonomous and does not require human involvement to make a firing decision? Then what we're dealing with for legal purposes is effectively a booby trap, a device set to protect property or persons without intervention from a human controller. A classic example of a booby trap is the spring gun. This typically involves a shotgun arranged so that it's pointed at a doorway. A string runs from the door to the trigger of the shotgun so that when the door is opened, the shotgun fires and strikes whoever was opening the door. A classic court case involving precisely this kind of spring gun is described in the 1971 Iowa Supreme Court decision of Katko v. Briney. I'll provide a link to that in the description. This was a civil lawsuit in which Briney, the owner of an uninhabited farmhouse, got tired of the place being burglarized repeatedly over the course of a decade. He set up a 20-gauge shotgun as a spring gun inside the building. Katko, the plaintiff in this lawsuit, illegally entered the farmhouse for the purpose of burglary. When he opened the booby trap door, the shotgun discharged, striking him in the right leg above the ankle, blowing away a substantial chunk of bone and flesh. Katko would plead guilty to the burglary and then filed a lawsuit against Briney for his injuries. At trial, the jury found for Katko, the burglar, and awarded him damages. Briney appealed this ruling in the decision mentioned above, and the appellate court affirmed or agreed with the finding of the trial court. Briney, the setter of the spring gun trap, was liable. The bottom line is that deadly force booby traps, like the spring gun trap set by Briney, are simply not lawful. In part, that's because when they operate in the absence of any threat to innocent persons, they are being used merely to defend property, and deadly force cannot be used in defense of mere property, except, of course, as noted in Texas. Another public policy concern is that although it's unlawful for a burglar to invade someone else's property, there do exist lawful reasons for invading someone else's property. Public safety officers, such as police or firemen, for example, are privileged to enter someone else's property without the owner's permission if certain exigent circumstances exist. An autonomous, deadly force booby trap would be unable to distinguish between a criminal burglar and a lawful fireman entering the premises and would kill both equally. This is not an outcome that public policy is willing to allow. To circle back to the sublethal remote gun, a legal defense can be made for its use as a deadly force weapon if it were being controlled by a human being, as we've already discussed. But there can be no legal defense for its use as a deadly force weapon if it is operating autonomously without human control. But what if we limit the same device to only sublethal potential, non-deadly force potential as it is currently designed? Could we then allow it to be operated autonomously, perhaps by artificial intelligence, with no human control? Arguably, the answer is yes, because the booby traps prohibited by law are deadly force booby traps. Non-deadly force booby traps, traps not capable of causing death or serious bodily injury, do not raise the kinds of proportionality and public policy concerns we saw described in that case of Katko v. Briney. And if that were true of a pole-mounted device, such as the sublethal remote gun that we're imagining could be operated in an autonomous mode, well, then that would be true of armed drones and robots, similarly operating in autonomous mode if their use of force potential was limited to non-deadly force. On the other hand, if we imagine drones and robots that are being controlled by a human being in real time, so that it is human decision-making that determines whether the drone or robot deploys force, then even deadly force would potentially be lawful, subject, of course, to the same conditions of deadly force that would be required to be met if the same human were physically present with a firearm. So there we have it, folks. The legal dynamics around the use of drones and robots for home defense, for both observational and use of force purposes in the context of use of force for both non-deadly and deadly force applications. Before I let you all go, I do want to share with you how you can get a free copy of our best-selling book, The Law of Self-Defense Principles, your handbook to being hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, or your property. We translate all the legalese into plain English so you can make better informed, more confident, more legally sound, and more decisive decisions in defense of what you value most. And perhaps best of all, most people tell us they can read this entire book in less than an afternoon. Check the book out on Amazon where it's 5-star rated, but don't buy it there. They'll charge you $25 for the book, plus shipping and handling. Order the book from us, and we only ask that you cover the cost of shipping the book to you. The book itself is free. Grab your free copy of The Law of Self-Defense Principles right now at lawofselfdefense.com/free book. I'll close out by reminding all of you that if you carry a gun so you're hard to kill, that's why I carry a gun, so I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to know the law so you're hard to convict as well. Until next time, I remain Attorney Andrew Branca at lawofselfdefense.com. Stay safe.